I'm Tina Sell, Director of Education at the Susquehanna Art Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Welcome to our virtual artist talk with painter Charles Edward Williams. We hope that you'll join us immediately following this program for a panel discussion with Charles and some special guests from our Harrisburg community. Sun and Light opened in the lobby gallery at the Susquehanna Art Museum on November 13th and was recently extended through April 11th, 2021. The exhibition and this virtual talk are made possible by contributions from our generous sponsors, Harrisburg University of Science and Technology and J. Randall and Barbara Grespin. Sun and Light is a collection of works taken from Charles's series, Everyone Loves the Sunshine. The images throughout the exhibition represent personal encounters from Charles's past and present involving the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. Hearing an artist speak about his inspirations, his processes, and his artwork adds an amazing dimension to experiencing a museum exhibition. Usually, looking deeply at a work of art can give you some insight into the act of making the work, but one still doesn't know where that imagery or where the creative decisions come from. Therefore, the communication between artist and viewer can feel like a one-way discussion, or at least one interrupted by time and space. So today, we are lifting barriers and bringing Charles Edward Williams to his viewers. A little bit about Charles. He was born in South Carolina. He's an award-winning exhibiting artist and lecturer with a BFA from Savannah College of Art and Design and his master's from University of North Carolina. His art's been featured in solo and group exhibitions nationally, and he has works in public collections and museums in Tennessee, North and South Carolina, and New Jersey. And Charles, as we were speaking just before we started, you have your feet in both the artistic and the scientific communities. If you wanted to just briefly explain that too, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, well, I can kind of talk about that later on because
Okay,
it fits within this whole narrative and story.
great, go with it.
Yeah, yeah. So no, I'm very honored. First, I want to say thank you again for all of this, and very honored to be here. Like anytime I can get a chance to, speak and share my thoughts, I don't take it lightly. So I'm really honored. So for me, I still view myself, as a 37-year-old man. I still view myself as a child playing in the candy store, and with art. And born and raised in Georgetown, South Carolina, which is a rural town, it allowed me to really observe. It allowed me, and I actually forced me to kind of pay attention to what's around me in my environment. Um, it forced me to kind of think outside the box and take in and utilize all of my senses. And so my mother at the age of 4 kind of saw that I had a gift of coloring in the lines, and I did. And so she still has those coloring books in the attic, but she and my father, they both fostered, my art career, fostered my talent, and helped continue to push me um, to where I can continue to be curious, and ask questions. Um, so, just to kind of give like a quick kind of story, um, after when I was in high school, I really couldn't figure out, you know, I was at this kind of plateau of like, well, I could do art or I could do sports. And my father kind of went into he went into my high school art teacher's classroom, and he said, "What can you do for my son? My son wants to be an artist, and you need to get him there." And so he kind of had like this sort of Western stare at my art teacher, and so it really intimidated him. But sure enough, my father got him on board to see what my father saw in me, more than I could even see in myself. And my art teacher set off to, pursue, um, getting me classes, private art lessons, watercolor classes and watercolor lessons. And then the other thing that was great with that, was that I was able to work with, private artists doing watercolor, but then yet learning the business side of things, of an artist. And so I would work at the Rice Museum in Georgetown, and pack boxes and deliver some of the, the gifts from the gift store from the museum, and that would pay for my art lessons. And then she would take me to, her name was Bruce Chandler. She would take me to her events and exhibitions. And on the car rides there to the exhibition, she would talk to me about, building relationships with people and making sure that you connect with your audience and making sure that you're staying true and authentic, um, to your craft, and honor it. Um, so that pushed me all the way through to getting into SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design. Got a couple of scholarships, got a couple of awards, and then when I got there, it was like this whole array of, oh, I could do photography, I could do graphic design, I could do advertising, I can do painting, I could do illustration, and so I kind of hopped and skipped around and dabbled into everything and stayed there actually 5 years. But I wound up graduating in graphic design and advertising. Um, and when I left, I did 3 years of graphic design and advertising, and I won a Gold Addy award, and won some other local and regional awards. But you know, the good thing about it was that it continued to push me, challenge my senses, and it kept me aware and fresh to where I always constantly had ideas, um, kind of poured out of me. Um, and I wasn't, when I was working and doing graphic design and advertising from 2006 when I graduated college all the way from 2010, I wasn't painting. I stopped painting and really focused into graphic design. And then I hit this other brick wall of wherein I felt like I wanted to do more. And this is kind of where the turning point happens and why this all applies to Sun and Light, the works that you see today. Um, because when I hit that brick wall, I felt like there was this inner spirit speaking to me of I wanted to really connect with the people. And when I say the people, meaning I wanted to connect with other artists, I wanted to connect with um, people in my community. I felt like this sort of calling to kind of give back, but I didn't really know how to go about doing that. And because I wasn't painting, I did a lot of journal writing, and so I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. And my grandmother, she was such a very sweet spiritual person. Um, and the thing about that is that she allowed, me to explore with her in the garden, kind of look at things, um, from a kind of spirituality, Christianity standpoint. And I'm grateful for that. So when I was in my cubicle, at my job, this is in 2010, I just won a Gold Addy. And I went to my boss and I went to my boss and told him I quit, and so he thought I was, he thought I was sick. He thought I needed a break, a vacation. But I said to him, no, I think I'm done. And when I set out to to be to when I set out to, be an artist, I didn't look back, and that was in 2010. And I'm grateful for that. But the thing that I was wanting to mention about Sun and Light is because I remembered, some of the things that my grandmother taught me. I remembered those principles and those lessons of, whenever you're unsure, whenever you feel like um, you need a sense of, strength, look up, you know. Um, and for her, it was all about God, in Christ. Um, she would always say, son, stay in the light, stay positive, stay hopeful, stay moving forward. And I did. And so that was kind of like the genesis of Sun and Light. And then fast forward, going back to grad school in 2015, where I got a full ride at UNCG, they literally helped me kind of understand why it's so important for the historical components to be involved in my work, and also they also help me understand how can I how can I execute and share and have my own unique visual voice. Um, and that was so important. That was really, really important. And so, 2015, I went to grad school, got in UNCG. I created these works in 2016, um, called "Put Your Hands Where My Eyes Can See," and this was when a huge influx of police brutalities were going on, and I was just really thinking about my grandmother again, of her, sharing with me, in the garden while I'm helping her, stay positive, stay in the light. My grandmother was really sweet, and so, I couldn't even tell if things were bothering her. She had really bad arthritis, but she continued to move forward and had this kind of upbeat, positive attitude. So she would share things with me that I kind of, had to sit with me, kind of simmer and resonate, with me over time. And so, when these huge influx of police brutalities happened in 2016, I was in my studio in grad school, and I was literally crying in my studio. It was like 3 days of crying, and mourning over, the unlawful acts of, African Americans being shot and um, beaten, and jazz was being played. And so I started thinking about how can I, insert myself, like how can I kind of pay homage, and also um, pose the question that, are we still really doing this in 2016? and and so I went back into history and started looking up artists who really um, documented troubling times, or documented the signs of the times, and documented what was really going on. Um, so Goya, I came across Goya, um, and he was able to document the Spanish War. And the way that he was able to do it, the series is the Disaster War series, and what he was doing with these etchings were powerful. They were so powerful. He was able to, incorporate religious iconography into the etchings. He was able to create motion and movement within the etchings, from going from the foreground, the middle ground, the background. He was able to um, you know, reestablish hierarchy within the narrative for what he was conveying. And again, religious iconography. So those three things were powerful, and what made it significant to me, because I said to myself, I wanted to document what was going on, but then also pose questions. And with Goya, with him kind of um, reestablishing, the hierarchy with, the subject, whether he would put the perpetrator, he would cast, leave it left white, or he would, put the victim, and cast shadow. I mean, all of these different decisions were made within these etchings. And so I made this body of work wherein I looked at these black and white photography, stock photography, um, and I was able to select the photos from these riots, from the riots in the 1930s all the way up to 60s. I was able to select these photographs, these black and white stock images, by the use of the hands of the victims. Because again, I was thinking about Goya and hierarchy, but then the question that he was posing within the hierarchy of these images and within the etchings. And because I was thinking about too my grandfather, and how always him, the principles that he lived by, Southern principles of, like, when you talk to a man or a woman, you look them dead in their eye, and when you shake, their hand, shake their hand firmly. And if you tell someone that you're going to do it, you follow through and you do as you say. Um, and what I wanted to get out of that is pose the question of, how can we reestablish trust? Growing up, for me, watching, like, I was literally would watch In the Heat of the Night, which is a cop show, with my grandmother. And so for me, police officers were superheroes for me. I never saw them as a threat. I never saw them as um, someone that I had to be cautious. I felt like if they wore the badge and they wore the uniform, that they were there for to protect us and everyone. It didn't matter what background you're from. And so because I was able to kind of tap into those authentic moments with my grandmother and my grandfather, 2016 series, was entitled "Put Your Hands Where My Eyes Can See," which is a term that police officers use. So again, I was able to look at Goya and his decision makings within the etchings, but then I was also able to kind of insert my own personal experiences that I've had of how I grew up watching and looking at interacting with police officers and the differences that we are experiencing them today. And so, and also taking the um, the the kind of motto and the principle that my grandfather lived by. I was able to use those and I chose those images and painted those. And the way that I paint is I literally paint like a watercolorist. I'm just using oil paint. Um, and I primarily paint with oil because of all the versatility and the properties, the characteristics that it has. And so once I got collected by the North Carolina Museum, from coming to my studio in 2016, things kind of, picked up for me. Um, and I was asked to do another show. And, but, before that, before getting asked to do another show, um, I was thinking about, okay, after, the police brutality has kind of calmed down a little bit. Um, I was feeling personally that I needed some sort of reprieve. I was thinking, at the end of the day, like, how can we reconnect, from these recent events and moments? And so I was thinking again about, well, for me as an African American male, and how, what did it look like for me to reconnect with my family, with my friends, and I was just sitting there looking out of my studio window, and I was thinking, I really miss like cookouts, and I really miss, barbecues. I really miss kind of getting together and being outside and grilling out and playing music and playing checkers and playing cards with families and family members and just that whole interaction. And so I started writing again in my journal, just some notes. And then I started thinking about my grandmother, of, you know, wanting to feel sort of this kind of fresh rejuvenation that I was looking for. And I remember specifically the moment when I was with her in the garden, and right before noon, because when noon happens, it's at soap opera time. That's when she watches she calls it the stories. And but I remember the sun just so vivid, so bright, and then just me interacting with her and feeling loved and connected. Um, and so that was the second kind of push of me leaning into sun and light. The first time was when I was in my office, and in 2010, thinking of like, I want to do more, and still those questions arise of like, how do I connect with the community? How do I connect with myself? How do I connect with others? Because I believe in being an instrument, an example, so others can um, kind of get closer to their purpose. Um, and so um, I I started looking at again moments, going through my books and my archives and photographs of in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s of you know people, black and whites, individuals like interacting. And I thought to myself, Well, looking at the positivity and what my grandmother spoke about within Sun and Light, how can I take this same subject of these, um, times of tension, and with race relation, how can I represent that? How can I um, recontextualize that? And so I started looking specifically of moments wherein um, humans were interacting with one another. Um, and then also too, I started thinking about breaking down what my grandmother said. Like 2016 series, I was thinking about my grandfather and how, he was saying the things of like of character. Look a man and a woman in their eyes, then guess what? That's gonna that you're being respectful. Um, when you shake a man or a woman's hands, it shows trust. So those principles that I did in 2016 and utilized those for the series, I did the same thing for Sun and Light. I looked at the principles that my grandmother, and the main principle that she shared with me is stay in the light, stay positive. And I started asking myself questions. Well, what is the light? What does that look like? Um, and so I think about the sun, so like literally sun, stay in the light. And then I received, so I kind of, continued to write. Didn't make any work at that moment, but I got a residency. I finished grad school 2017, and I got a residency um, at Otis College over in California. And I was able to, it was like for a month or two, and I had no idea of what I wanted to work on. And I remember going to the Los Angeles Museum, Art Museum, and I walked in and just kind of had my headphones on, just staring, looking at the art. I came across abstract expressionist Franz Klein, and there were these gigantic images, brushstrokes, these gigantic brushstrokes of black brushstrokes on top of these kind of layered white stark backgrounds. And I was just like, wow, because I've seen his work in books, but to really see it in person, I was able to see the layers, the depth, the expressions, the emotions. I was even able to pick it apart and feel the energy. Um, that he exerted with the paint. I was able to see again the versatility, the paint and the characteristics, and he showed those through each of these paintings that I saw at the Los Angeles Museum, and it was breathtaking for me. I literally stayed in the museum and stared at those paintings, and I said to myself, "That's it." I said, "That's it." When you think about the abstract expressionist movement, it was all about getting back to self and reclaiming self and wanting to share freedom of expression. So I said to myself, "That's it." That's the same thing. From that movement, that was the same thing that my grandmother was sharing with me. So um, I literally went to every single museum in LA that had a Franz Klein and sat there and just I took notes, I drew, sketched out the paintings that the large paintings that he did, and then I went back to the room and I said, well, you know what? Let me what what other color can I use? Because I felt like he used black. I didn't want to copy, but then I also wanted to have my own voice. I was like, let me look up different colors I should use. So then I started looking up, the psychology of color. Then I started looking up color theorist Joseph Alberts. And then I was like, again, that's it. So when I came across yellow, it really just fit. The human characteristics or psychological properties of yellow. It's curious, observant, happy, cautious. Because when you look around, in our world today, when you look at you know yellow caution tape. You look at the yellow stop light or the yield sign, or you look at the yellow, happy face, smiley faces, or yellow used for school buses. Um, I just realized that, like, from studying and researching, that yellow has these human-like properties, psychological properties that I thought would be fitting for me to use throughout the series, um, to convey innocence and connectivity, because as humans we're very, very, very complex. Um, but that's the greatest thing that makes us connected. Within our complexities, within our layers, within our dualities, um, that is the equalizer. Um, and so um, I just started playing around with just playing music in my studio, large papers, large canvases, and just really expressing myself with the color yellow. Um, and then that later on, as I couldn't really figure out the images that I wanted to use. Um, but then the images started, speaking to me after I looked through my books again. I looked through some of the museum archives, and then it just started speaking to me. And the first one I did of um, of the yellow was called "The American Dream," um, and this is the funny thing about that. There's so many layers to American Dream piece, because the American Dream piece. Um, I was looking in the archives of in LA. Um, and then I went to in the museum, and then I went to the bookstore. Well, I went to another museum, the Underground Museum, and I got this book, and the book had the same image that I saw, and it was of these two kids playing on this monument, and the boy at the top was like this, young child, but like um, confident, somewhat mischievous, but confident, happy, strong, empowered. And then the kid underneath, from reading his expression, was sort of like his protector, his brother, his um, or a family member that watched out for him. So he was a little older, but relaxed. And I read further that this was a monument on a school campus, but I said, you know what, like, that's it. And so I was again thinking about, how do I insert my own personal story in the narrative and in the canon, in the art canon. So I said to myself, well, I can see me as a little kid on top of the monument, and then I see my older brother, as um, the protector. And so I started the large painting with various brushstrokes, yellow brushstrokes, and pushed and pulled the yellow paint forward and back with the white, and then I painted on top. And then I also made some decision making with scraping some off, and sometimes when I do that, when I paint and then I'll scrape off areas, to show some of the, the foundational layers. um, that for me is excavating. I like to show that I'm physically as excavating my own history, my own past, um, and unveiling that and uncovering that and sharing that. Um, so I'm inviting the viewer to make sure that they are involved with the process of examining, or examination, and questioning his or herself and where they stand in relationship to the artwork, and where they stand in relationship to the world, and what's going on in our social political environment. And that piece turned out to be a success for me, and it set kind of the precedent of all of the works in the Sun and Light series. And then I started thinking even further, in regards to color choices. And so, the pink, love, the green, growth, the purple, um, spirituality, the sky blue, spiritual wisdom. Um, all of these colors of that I embrace um, for empowerment, I wanted to fuse into the series. And what I learned too, or what I make sure that I try to do within each series is I'm wanting the viewer to come through a journey, to go with me through this journey. And I'm not a person who likes to continue to do the same paintings over and over and over. I think for me, like many of us, like our favorite musicians, our favorite artists, musicians, when they have various albums, they can come out with a Christmas album, they can come out with a few of their own records, and they can come out with a country version, or there's so many various versions and stages, um, and techniques and aspects that um, a musician, our favorite musicians, um, or renditions that they do that we love, that we're still fans of them. And so for me, I've always wanted to make sure, as a visual communicator, that the content drives the aesthetics of my work. The decision makings that I'm making in the studio is because of me researching and studying the work. It's also me understanding art history. Um, it's also understanding, you know, um, the world that I live in presently, and and then also the questions that I want to ask. And so within those decisions, and it helps me to make sure that, like, okay, this is going to be a nice layered, engaged piece for people to have a dialogue to talk about. Um, and I just find it very interesting, that for me personally, when I go in museums or when I see a work of art, I want to stand there and dissect it. I want to stand there and engage with it, interact with it. I want to leave there, just like you've left your restaurant, you know, left a restaurant and you're blown away by the food and how it tastes and how it hits all of your senses. And I think that's the power of art that sometimes is missed, is that, I still believe that for me, painting is the most powerful, strongest medium to use. And I want to continue to show that through the content of my work. Um, and so, paying homage to my grandmother again, I said to myself, all right, we're going to go back to the 60s, and think about, her time that she lived in. And I saw some other Andy Warhols uh, in the LA Museum. And I said, well, here's Andy Warhol paying homage to, you know, Marilyn Monroe. And he's able to repeat the image over and over and over and over and over and over. And I'm like, well, I think my grandma's pretty cool. I think she's pretty special. I mean, why can't I repeat her image over and over? But I didn't do that. What I wound up doing is I said, well, what sort of kind of super group um, was, who made an impact in the 60s? And it was the Freedom Riders. And I said, well, instead of just doing women and men, like painting their portraits, why not just paint the women, which would pay homage to my grandmother and all the women, the strong women across, in this world, in this country, um, but do it differently. I studied Andrew Warhol's process of making as a, Andy Warhol's process, he would screen print first, and then he would paint on top. And said, well, okay, if I want to insert myself in the canon, why don't I just reverse his process? So what I did is I painted, and I'm still in the process of doing this, but I painted a few of the Freedom Rider women who were involved with the Freedom Riders in the 1960s, and because Andy Warhol screen printed first and then um, painted second, what I did is painted first and then created the aesthetics of screen printing second. So when you zoom in and you look at screen print, you can see the little dots that are like, the hollow dots. And I said, well, let me just figure this out and how can I create those dots? So I looked all over my studio and I was like, let me take these Bounty paper towels and, and start scrubbing. And I scrubbed away and discarded the portrait, and it created these little dots, just like because the dots are in the paper towels. And and it worked. And it worked. And then after it dries, then I put the yellow on top. And so the goal is for me is to paint. I think there's like between 80 and 85 elements, maybe a little bit more elements on the periodic table. But I said to myself, I want this to be a teachable, lesson, because I also heard, growing up in the South, behind every good man, there's a strong woman, right? So again, like I said before, taking sort of personal moments of things that I've heard, principles that I live by, or that I heard people live by, and my grandmother and my grandfather lived by. I said, well, why can't women be strong on their own? So I said, well, how can I make this a teachable moment? So I said, well, let me how what does it look like to combine all of the women that were involved in the Freedom Riders and put them on the wall to make a teachable moment? And I said, how can I do that? And so thinking about me as a child and going to school, I was like, what subject can I use? Math, science, and then there's therefore science. And so I came across of the periodic table, and I was like, okay, well, when I think about, what the periodic stands for, when you combine elements, they create this chemical combustion. Um, and so within elements creating this chemical combustion, well, the Freedom Rise had women and men. So when the women and men got together, it created this moment in history. There was this sort of huge moment that's documented in history of the Freedom Rides. And so my love for science is kind of coming in, through my artwork. And so I haven't created all 82, but I'm getting there. Um, but that's the whole vision of those portraits that you see at the museum. Um, and I'm trying to think of what are some of the other main
There,
pieces.
there was one triptych, Scramble,
Oh, scrambled, yeah.
that I wanted you
So
to spend a minute or two with and just kind of
yeah,
talk about that.
yeah. Scramble is it's taken from the McKinney pool party down in Texas. I think it was like 2000. I think it was like 2015, something like that. And because I personally have had three drownings where I've been brought back. Um, I have, and I grew up on the river, so I have sort of this kind of love hate thing with water. I just also thought it was a another teachable moment for me to kind of pose the question of how we view police officers. So what happened in the McKinney pool party was a group of teenagers, African American teenagers, were having a party in this particular neighborhood, and the cops were called, and the cops um, were violently abusing these teenagers. And so one um, incident that was caught on camera of this white police officer literally dragging this young black girl to the ground and holding her down and pinning her down. And again, it took me back to my 2016 works of posing the question, but then also it took me back to in context of art of Goya and his disaster war series, and how can I recontextualize this? How can I reappropriate this? How can I, add visual hierarchy? And what I did is I was thinking about Goy and how he was able to move the image from the foreground to middle ground and the background in his etchings. And the way he was able to do that is he would repeat the image, but then he would alter it. He would slightly alter, the second image, and then a third image, and the background would be slightly altered. And so that would be, movement within the etchings. And so what I did when I saw the videotape on YouTube of the police officer kind of pinning the girl down, I I froze the frames. I froze the frames, screenshotted them. Um, and first, before I even did that, I watched it like at least 20 times or more. And what I did is I took my pen and my pad and I followed the police officer moving in and out of the frame of the camera. And like I followed him running in and out, chasing this girl. And I had this kind of marking of this police officer's movement. And so those same markings I kept to put behind the images of the young girl and him, as a triptych. And then the other thing is I did it in yellow. And then the other thing I did is I created the images, or I chose the images specifically to wherein of the frames that I froze from the video to wherein you don't know whether he's helping the girl or hurting the girl. And again, that's me making the conscious decision of posing these questions again to the viewer. Where do we stand? With everything that's going on, where do you stand? Um, and how do we get back to connecting, as human beings? And then I was thinking about, um, Albert's and his squares, um, and so I drew the boxes in the background, the yellow markings in the background, because again, that represented for me the frame, you know, of me tracing or recording and documenting, this incident of police officer running out of the frame, in and out of the frame. Um, but then also posing the question to the viewers, if you were in this frame, if you were there, what would you do? What would you have done? And then when you see this image of this police officer and this young girl, are they in the are they in the frame? Are they out of the frame? Are they in the box? Are they out of the box? So again, it's a conversation that I'm having with the viewer. That I chose to do it in thirds. I thought it came out pretty successfully. So yeah.
It's a very powerful piece. I love
Mhm.
looking at that with people who come to visit in the
Yeah.
museum because the narrative is so ambiguous, that
Mm.
push and pull of what's really happening,
Right.
what's first, what's
Right.
second. It
Exactly.
challenges, are we reading it from left to right? Are we reading
Absolutely.
it, the center? And that the yellow, it's funny that you mentioned the
Mm.
tracing of the actions of the police officers
Yeah.
because I recently went to an exhibition of Howardina Pindell
Mm.
and how she would often trace the television and the
Mm-hmm.
movements there. And
Yeah.
a lot of her abstract compositions were coming from her
Right.
literally putting tracing paper on top of the
Yeah.
TV. And there's that sense in both
Yeah.
Yellow, the Freedom Riders, and Scramble of
Mm-hmm.
looking at history or witnessing the past through television. And I
Exactly.
think those of us who are of a similar age, that's kind of a
Mm-hmm.
prevalent part of our visual language is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
looking at a framework through TV. And so the little
Exactly.
dots and
Exactly.
the Albers, the
Yeah.
reference to Albers and the squares,
Mm-hmm.
it's how we see our current and our past is
Absolutely.
completely chosen for us by what appears on our television
Absolutely.
screens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, it's, I think about it too. It's like, you know, um, a lot of us, I was to say younger generation, okay, I've heard the remarks of, well, I didn't grow up back then. So they're somewhat kind of emotionally removed from it.
Sure.
And so they're looking, at these images, at these horrific images through, frames,
Sure.
and so again, I'm just wanting to um, strive to reconnect the emotional ties. It's like, Susan Sontag, how she mentions of like, we're so inundated of like seeing these horrific images over and over and over and over and over, where we've lost that human emotional connectivity and that touch, to feel and to respond. And so that has always stuck out to me in her readings, her writings, of how to um, connect through human emotion within visual art, or within, or representation, with photographs or images. So anyway,
So right. Thank you very much. This has
I
been
hope that wasn't too much, but
no, it's a wonderful opportunity to
yeah,
speak with you. And I hope everyone will tune in for our panel discussion where we can dive in a little deeper and hear
yeah,
some other voices. But I want to thank you again, Charles, and just let you know how wonderful it is to have this, have your voice and your face
hmm,
and help us connect with the
right,
images that we see in the museum. Thank you very
absolutely.
much.
Thank you, thank you.